The gunshot echoed through the warehouse before Dante Marchetti even understood what he was looking at. His men had called him in the middle of the night, their voices shaking, telling him that a shipment worth millions had vanished from a guarded location. No alarms had gone off. No cameras had caught a face. Only one person had the access codes, the schedule, and the trust required to make something that valuable disappear without a trace. Elena Rossi. Dante stood in his office an hour later, staring at a folder of evidence his men had gathered. Photographs of Elena entering a restricted building, a deleted string of messages recovered from a cracked phone, a bank transfer to an account nobody could identify. Every piece pointed to her, and every piece felt like a blade pressed against his chest. For 3 years, Elena had been more than an assistant to him. She organized his life down to the smallest detail, remembered things before he asked for them, and somehow made the chaos of his world feel manageable. He trusted her with information he had never given anyone else. He trusted her with his silence, which for a man like him was rarer than trust with words. He remembered the way she used to laugh quietly at his dry jokes, the way she never flinched when things around him grew dangerous, the way she looked him directly in the eye even when powerful men in the room refused to meet his gaze. She was the only person who had never seemed afraid of him. Now, staring at the folder, he wondered if that had all been a performance. His phone buzzed. It was Marco, his most senior lieutenant, a man who had been at his side since they were young and hungry and building something out of nothing. Marco's voice was low and careful. "She's on her way to the office. Should we bring her in?" Dante closed his eyes for a moment. Let her come. When Elena walked through the door 20 minutes later, she looked the same as always. Calm, composed, her dark hair pulled back, her coat still damp from the rain outside. She smiled at him the way she always did, unaware that the room had turned into a courtroom and she was the only one on trial. "You wanted to see me?" she asked. Dante slid the folder across the desk without a word. She opened it and he watched her face carefully, searching for a crack, a flicker of guilt, anything that would confirm what he already believed. Instead, her eyes widened with confusion, then fear. "This isn't real," she said. "Dante, I didn't do this." "The codes were yours," he said, his voice flat and controlled, the voice he used when he needed people to know an argument was already over. "The building was accessed with your credentials. The messages were sent from your number." "I don't know how," she said, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "I swear to you, I don't know how this happened." He wanted to believe her. Some part of him, buried under years of building walls around himself, wanted nothing more than to believe her. But he had learned a long time ago that wanting to believe something was often the first step toward being destroyed by it. "I trusted you," he said quietly, "more than anyone." "You still can," she said, stepping closer. "Please, someone is setting me up." "Who would do that?" he asked. "Who else had access to everything you had access to?" She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She didn't have a name to give him, no thread to pull, nothing except her own word against a folder full of evidence that looked airtight. Dante stood, and the movement alone was enough to make the temperature in the room drop. "You have 2 hours to leave the city," he said. "If I see you again, it will not be a conversation." "Dante." "Go," he said, and this time his voice cracked just slightly, just enough for only her to hear it, before he turned away and refused to look at her again. She left without another word. He heard her footsteps fade down the hallway, then the sound of the front door closing, and then nothing. Silence settled over the office like dust. Marco appeared in the doorway a moment later. "You did the right thing," he said. Dante didn't answer. He sat back down at his desk, staring at the folder, at the photographs, at the evidence that should have given him peace but instead left him hollow. That night he didn't sleep. He kept replaying every conversation he'd ever had with Elena, searching for a hidden meaning, a lie he had missed, a warning sign he had ignored because he hadn't wanted to see it. He remembered the way she had once stayed up with him until dawn, helping him solve a problem that could have cost him everything, refusing to leave even when he told her to go home and rest. He remembered the quiet dinners they shared when the office emptied out, the two of them talking about nothing important, just enjoying the rare stillness. None of it made sense with what the folder claimed she had done. But evidence was evidence, and in his world, feelings were a luxury that got people killed. Over the following days, Dante threw himself into work, trying to fill the space Alina had left behind. He hired a new assistant, a competent young man named Nathan who tried his best, but had none of Alina's instinct, none of her ability to read a room before anyone spoke. Every mistake Nathan made, every question he had to ask that Alina would have already known the answer to, reminded Dante of what he had lost. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself she had betrayed him, and betrayal deserved no mourning. But late at night, alone in his office, he would sometimes find himself staring at the empty chair where she used to sit, wondering where she had gone and whether she was safe. A week later, something happened that shook the foundation of everything he believed. A second shipment disappeared, this one even more valuable than the first, taken from a location that Alina had never had access to. Only a small circle of people knew about it, people who had been with Dante for years, people he trusted completely. Alina couldn't have done this one. She was gone. She had no way of knowing about a location created after she had already left. Dante sat with that fact for a long time, turning it over in his mind like a stone he couldn't put down. If she hadn't done this one, had she really done the first one? He called Marco into his office and asked him to review everything again, every piece of evidence from the beginning, this time with fresh eyes. Marco agreed readily enough, but something in the way he agreed, a half-second of hesitation before his voice steadied, caught Dante's attention. He said nothing about it, not yet, but he filed it away, the way he filed away every small inconsistency that had ever mattered in his line of work. 2 nights later, Dante found himself standing outside the apartment building where Alina used to live before she disappeared, unable to explain to himself why he had driven there instead of going home. The windows of her old apartment were dark. A stranger's name was already on the buzzer. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold, staring up at the building, and for the first time since the night he had sent her away, he let himself ask a question he had been avoiding. What if he had been wrong? The thought terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced, because if he was wrong, then he hadn't just lost his most trusted assistant. He had thrown away the one person who had ever made him feel like more than the empire he had built around himself. He didn't know where she had gone. He didn't know if she was safe, if she had left the city like he ordered, or if something worse had happened to her. The not knowing sat in his chest like a stone, heavier every day. He thought about the fear in her eyes when she looked at the folder, a fear that hadn't looked like guilt at all when he really let himself remember it. It had looked like disbelief. It had looked like someone watching their whole world collapse for reasons they couldn't understand. Dante was a man who prided himself on reading people, on knowing the difference between truth and performance, and standing outside that dark apartment window, he finally admitted to himself that he might have read her wrong on the most important night of both their lives. He got back in his car and sat there for a long time, hands resting on the wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing. Somewhere out there, Alina was alone, cut off from everyone she knew, carrying an accusation she hadn't earned. And somewhere close to him, someone else was still operating freely, someone who had used her trust and her access to hide their own hands. He started the engine and drove back toward his office, a new kind of resolve settling over him, colder and more focused than anger had ever been. If someone had used Alina to cover their tracks, he was going to find out who. And when he did, there would be no folder of evidence needed. He would know the truth himself, because this time he intended to look for it instead of waiting for it to be handed to him. The city passed by in blurred lights outside his window, and for the first time in days, Dante allowed himself to think not about betrayal, but about the possibility that he still had a chance to make things right, if only he could find her before it was too late. He didn't know yet how close that possibility was to slipping away entirely, or how far Alina had already been pulled from the safety he assumed she'd found. All he knew was that the 2 hours he had given her to disappear now felt like the worst decision he had ever made, and every hour that passed afterward felt like a debt he owed her that was quietly, dangerously growing. Back at his desk, he opened the folder one more time, but this time he wasn't looking at it as proof of her guilt. He was looking at it as a puzzle someone else had built, carefully enough to fool a man who missed almost nothing. Somewhere in that folder was a mistake. Every fabricated story had one. He simply hadn't been looking for it before, because he hadn't wanted to see anything except what confirmed his fear. Now he intended to look at everything differently, no matter what it cost him or how long it took, because the alternative, living with the idea that he had destroyed the one person who had never once lied to him, was something he was no longer willing to accept. He picked up his phone and called Marco again, his voice steady but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Pull every file connected to that first shipment," he said. "Everyone who touched it, everyone who knew the schedule. I want names, not assumptions." There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but noticeable. "Understood," Marco said finally. Dante hung up and stared out the window at the city lights, a quiet storm building behind his calm expression. Somewhere out there, the truth was waiting to be found, and for the first time since sending Alina away, he felt something other than anger guiding him forward. He felt purpose, and he intended to follow it wherever it led, even if it meant confronting people he had once called family, even if it meant admitting that the trust he had broken might already be beyond repair. All that mattered now was finding her, and finding out who had truly betrayed him. The night stretched on, and Dante did not sleep again, his mind working through every detail, every name, every possibility, searching for the thread that would finally unravel the lie standing between him and the truth he was determined to uncover. Somewhere across the city, in a place he did not yet know to look, Alina was fighting to survive the consequences of a crime she never committed, unaware that the man who had sent her away was already beginning to search for a way to bring her home. The distance between them had never felt so dangerous, and neither of them yet understood how much closer that danger was about to become. Alina had not gone far. She had planned to leave the city the way Dante ordered, to disappear somewhere quiet until the accusation blew over or until she could somehow prove her innocence, but she never got the chance. Within hours of walking away from Dante's office, a car had pulled up beside her on an empty street, and 2 men she did not recognize forced her inside before she could scream for help. She woke up in a small, windowless room with concrete walls and a single flickering light overhead. Her wrists were bound, her head throbbing from where she had struck it during the struggle. For a long moment, she thought she was dreaming, that none of this could be real, that yesterday she had still been organizing Dante's calendar, and today she was somehow a prisoner in a place she didn't recognize. A door opened, and a man stepped inside. She recognized him immediately, though seeing him here made her stomach turn cold. "Marco." "You," she whispered. He crouched in front of her, his expression calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I need you to understand something," he said. "None of this is personal. You were simply in the right place to take the blame." "It was you," she said, the pieces falling into place all at once. "You stole the shipment, you framed me." "I built something over many years," Marco said. Dante trusts me completely, which meant I needed someone else to disappear when the questions started. You were convenient, efficient, trusted, and easy to make look guilty. He'll figure it out, Alina said, though her voice shook. He's not stupid. Perhaps, Marco said, standing again. But by the time he does, it won't matter. You'll be long gone, and I'll be exactly where I've always been, standing beside him, telling him what he needs to hear. He left her there without another word, and the door locked with a heavy metal sound that seemed to swallow whatever hope she had left. Days passed in that room, though she lost track of exactly how many. She was given just enough food and water to survive, nothing more. Nobody spoke to her except the occasional guard who came to check that she was still there. She spent the hours replaying every moment with Dante, wondering if he ever thought about her, wondering if he believed, even for a second, that she might be innocent. She thought about the way his voice had cracked when he told her to leave, a small break in his usual iron control that she had almost missed. It was the only thing that gave her any comfort in that dark room, the memory that somewhere beneath his anger there had been something else. Regret, maybe, or grief. She held onto that thought the way a person holds onto a single flame in a storm, small and fragile, but enough to keep the darkness from swallowing her completely. Meanwhile, across the city, Dante was tearing through every file connected to the missing shipment, cross-referencing names, verifying alibis, searching for anything that would explain how the second theft could have happened without Alina's involvement. Nathan, his new assistant, worked long hours trying to keep up with Dante's growing list of demands, pulling records, checking security logs, tracking down anyone who had been near either location on the nights in question. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience Dante had never been known for, but he forced himself through it anyway, because the alternative was losing the thread entirely. 3 names kept appearing near both locations. One was a low-level guard who had no access to sensitive information and no motive Dante could find. Another was a supplier who had been with the organization for less than a year and had nothing to gain from betrayal. The third name stopped Dante cold. Marco. He stared at the name on the page for a long time, telling himself it meant nothing. Marco had been near both locations because Marco was near everything, a senior figure trusted with oversight across the entire operation. It would have been strange if his name hadn't appeared somewhere in the records. But the more Dante stared at it, the more the small hesitations of the past week came back to him. The pause on the phone when Dante asked him to review the evidence again. The way Marco had been so quick to convince him Alina was guilty in the first place, arriving with the folder of evidence before Dante had even asked for an investigation. He remembered something else, too. A conversation from months earlier that he had barely registered at the time, Marco mentioning offhandedly that Alina was becoming too involved in decisions that used to belong only to senior leadership. At the time, it had sounded like simple observation. Now, it sounded like the beginning of a plan. Dante called Nathan into his office. Pull everything you can find on Marco's financial activity over the past year. Quietly. I don't want anyone else to know we're looking. Nathan hesitated. Sir, Marco is. I know who he is, Dante said. That's exactly why I need you to be careful. Over the following days, a picture began to form, slow and painful, like a wound reopening after it had already begun to heal. Small transfers to accounts that didn't match any known supplier. Meetings that weren't recorded on any official schedule. A pattern of behavior that, taken individually, meant nothing, but together painted an unmistakable picture. Marco had been building something of his own, quietly, patiently, using Dante's trust as cover the entire time. Dante sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, feeling a rage he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Not just because Marco had betrayed him, though that alone would have been enough to shatter the foundation of everything he had built. It was the realization that Marco's betrayal had cost him something far more painful than money or power. It had cost him Alina. He thought about where she might be now, whether she had left the city as he ordered, whether she was safe somewhere far away, trying to rebuild a life after he had destroyed the one she had, or whether something worse had happened, something he refused to let himself fully consider until he had more information. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months, an old contact who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. If Alina had truly left the city, this man would be able to track her movements. If she hadn't, if something had happened to her instead, Dante needed to know that too, no matter how difficult the truth might be. The call connected, and Dante spoke quietly, giving details, describing Alina, asking for anything, any trace of where she might have gone after the night he sent her away. The answer that came back 2 days later was not what he expected. There was no record of Alina leaving the city. No flights, no trains, no border crossings, nothing at all after the night she walked out of his office. It was as if she had vanished into the air itself. Dante's blood ran cold as the possibilities narrowed to something far more dangerous than he had allowed himself to imagine. If she hadn't left willingly, then someone had taken her, and the timing lined up perfectly with everything he had just discovered about Marco. He stood from his desk, the calm control he usually wore like armor slipping away entirely, replaced by something sharper and more urgent. He needed proof, real proof, not suspicion, before he confronted a man who had been at his side for over a decade. One mistake now could cost him everything, including whatever chance remained of finding Alina alive. He gathered a small group of men he trusted completely, men who had no connection to Marco's inner circle, and gave them a single task: watch him, follow him, find out where he goes when he thinks no one is paying attention. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, Dante felt something shift inside him, a determination sharper than grief, sharper than guilt. He had spent the past week mourning a decision he couldn't take back, but mourning would not bring Alina home. Only the truth would, and he intended to drag it into the light no matter what it cost him. That night, one of his men called with news that made Dante's stomach drop. Marco had been seen driving to the outskirts of the city, to an area with old warehouses that hadn't been used in years, a place with no reason for a man like him to visit unless he had something or someone he needed to keep hidden. Dante didn't wait for morning. He gathered his men immediately, his mind racing through every possibility, every fear he had been holding back since the moment he realized how wrong he might have been. As his car sped through the empty streets toward the edge of the city, Dante allowed himself, for the first time in days, to hope that he wasn't already too late. But hope, he knew, was a fragile thing in his world, and the closer he got to the warehouse, the more he braced himself for whatever truth was waiting for him in the dark. The warehouse district sat quiet under a heavy sky, rows of abandoned buildings stretching along a cracked road that hadn't seen regular traffic in years. Dante's car slowed as they approached, headlights cutting through the darkness, and he signaled for the driver to stop well before they reached the address his men had tracked Marco to. He wanted to see for himself, not send someone else in first, not this time. He stepped out into the cold night air, his men falling into formation behind him without a word, moving with the practiced silence of people who had done this before. The building ahead looked like every other structure on the street: rusted metal siding, broken windows, a chain-link fence sagging under years of neglect. Nothing about it suggested it held any answers. But Dante had learned long ago that the most important secrets were always kept in the most forgettable places. They found a side entrance, the lock broken, the door slightly ajar as if someone had been careless, or as if someone hadn't expected anyone to come looking. Dante pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in the silence, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a single bulb hanging from a wire somewhere deeper in the building. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of rust and stale water. For a moment, Dante wondered if this had been a mistake, if Marco's visit here meant nothing at all. Then he heard it, a faint sound barely audible coming from somewhere further inside. A voice, weak and strained but unmistakably human. His heart began pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He moved toward the sound, his men close behind him, weapons ready but lowered, everyone moving with the same careful urgency. They found a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway, and behind it the sound grew clearer. Someone was there. Someone was alive. Dante's men broke the lock quickly, and the door swung open to reveal a small room, cold and bare except for a single chair and a figure slumped against the far wall. Elena. Dante's breath caught in his chest. She looked nothing like the composed, confident woman who had walked out of his office days earlier. Her face was pale, her clothes torn, and there was a dark bruise along her temple that made his stomach twist with fury and fear all at once. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open only slightly as the light from the hallway spilled into the room. "Elena," he said, rushing to her side, dropping to his knees without a second thought for anything else in the world. Her eyes struggled to focus on him, confusion and disbelief crossing her weakened features. "Dante," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath, "you came." "I'm here," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he checked her for injuries, relief and horror washing over him in equal measure. "I'm here. You're safe now." "I didn't do it," she said, her voice breaking. "I never." "I know," he said, cutting her off gently. "I know I was wrong. I'm so sorry." Tears slipped down her face, whether from pain or relief he couldn't tell, and probably both. He gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injuries, and lifted her from the cold floor. One of his men stepped forward. "Sir, we should get her to a doctor immediately." "Someone we trust," quietly. Dante nodded, already moving toward the door, cradling Elena against his chest as if she might disappear again if he loosened his grip for even a moment. "Call ahead," he said. "I want everything ready before we arrive." As they made their way back through the warehouse, Elena's voice, weak but urgent, stopped him. "Marco," she said. "It was Marco. He took the shipment. He set me up." Dante's jaw tightened, the confirmation settling into place beside everything he had already suspected. "I know," he said quietly. "I found out. That's how I found you." "He said no one would figure it out in time," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed again, exhaustion overtaking her. "He said you would never doubt him." "He was wrong," Dante said, his voice hard now, all the warmth from a moment ago replaced by something colder and more dangerous. "About everything." They reached the car, and Dante gently placed Elena inside, staying close to her the entire drive to a private doctor his organization trusted with situations exactly like this one. Someone who worked quietly and asked no questions. The doctor examined her carefully, cleaning her wounds, checking for any serious injuries, and after what felt like the longest hour of Dante's life, delivered the news that she would recover, that nothing was permanently damaged, that with rest and care she would be herself again. Dante didn't leave her side. He sat in a chair beside the bed where she rested, watching her breathe steadily for the first time since he found her, and let himself feel the full weight of everything he had almost lost. He thought about the 2 hours he had given her to leave the city, the anger in his voice, the way he had refused to listen to her when she tried to explain. He thought about every day since then that he had spent doubting himself, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, and now here she was, proof that his instincts had failed him when it mattered most, and that only luck and stubborn determination had brought him to her in time. He reached out and gently took her hand, careful not to disturb her rest, and made a silent promise to himself. Whatever it took, he would make this right. Not just by punishing Marco for what he had done, though that reckoning was coming and coming soon, but by earning back the trust he had thrown away so easily. Hours later, Alina stirred, her eyes opening slowly, adjusting to the dim light of the room. She found Dante still seated beside her, his hand still holding hers, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You stayed," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not again." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps simply trying to understand how quickly everything had changed. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I started looking the moment I realized the second theft couldn't have been you," he said. "I should have looked sooner. I should have trusted you from the beginning." "You believed the evidence," she said. "Anyone would have." "You wouldn't have," he said. "If our positions were reversed, you would have looked deeper before condemning me." She didn't argue, because she knew he was right, though she appreciated that he didn't try to excuse himself further. He simply sat with the truth of what he had done, uncomfortable as it was, and let her see that he understood the weight of it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest," he said, "and when you're ready we deal with Marco together." Her expression hardened slightly at the mention of his name, the fear and pain of the past days flickering behind her eyes. "He said you would never doubt him," she repeated. "He was so confident." "He mistook loyalty for blindness," Dante said. "I trusted him for a long time, but trust isn't the same as certainty, and I intend to make sure he understands the difference before this is over." Alina managed a faint, tired smile despite everything she had been through. "You sound like yourself again." "I never stopped," he said. "I just lost my way for a few days." She squeezed his hand weakly, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, simply grateful for the quiet after everything that had happened. Outside, the city continued moving as it always did, unaware of the storm that had passed and the one that was still building, waiting for Marco to realize that his carefully built lie was about to collapse entirely. Dante stayed by her side through the night, watching over her the way he should have protected her from the very beginning, and as dawn broke outside the window, he felt a new resolve settling over him, calm and unshakable. Marco had taken something precious from him and nearly destroyed the one person who had never once betrayed his trust. Dante intended to make sure that mistake became the last one Marco would ever get the chance to make. Alina's recovery took several days, and during that time, Dante kept his organization running with a careful, controlled calm that hid the storm building underneath. He visited her every morning and every evening, bringing small things to make her more comfortable, sitting with her for hours even when there was nothing urgent to discuss, simply because he could not bring himself to be far from her after everything that had happened. Nathan handled the daily operations with growing confidence, and Dante found himself quietly grateful for the young man's steady presence, even as he privately hoped Alina would return to her position once she was strong enough. Not because Nathan lacked ability, but because no one understood the rhythm of Dante's world the way Alina did. Meanwhile, Marco remained unaware that his plan had unraveled. He continued his usual routine, offering updates to Dante about the ongoing investigation into the missing shipments, suggesting new leads that led nowhere, subtly steering suspicion away from himself with the same confidence that had convinced Dante of Alina's guilt in the first place. Dante played along, careful not to let anything in his expression or behavior reveal what he now knew. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done, sitting across from a man who had once been like family, listening to him lie without flinching, all while knowing exactly what that man had done to the person Dante cared about most. But Dante understood the importance of patience. A confrontation without proof would only give Marco the chance to escape or worse, to disappear the way he had made others disappear before. Dante needed everything in place first. The evidence, The timing. The certainty that when the moment came, there would be no room for Marco to twist the truth or turn Dante's own men against him. His men continued gathering information quietly, tracing the stolen shipments to buyers Marco had been secretly working with, uncovering an entire secondary operation Marco had been building for months, hidden beneath the surface of the organization Dante had spent years constructing. It was more extensive than Dante had imagined, a careful, patient betrayal designed to slowly siphon resources and loyalty away, until Marco was ready to make his move completely. The scale of it left Dante both furious and, in a strange way, impressed by how thoroughly Marco had planned everything. It made the betrayal feel even more personal, knowing it hadn't been a moment of weakness or a single bad decision, but a long, calculated plan built on the assumption that Dante would never look closely enough to notice. When Alina finally felt strong enough to leave the private residence where she had been recovering, she insisted on being part of what came next. Dante hesitated at first, worried about her safety, but she was firm. "He took weeks of my life and nearly took everything else," she said. "I want to be there when the truth comes out." Dante studied her for a long moment, seeing the same quiet strength that had first made him trust her all those years ago, unshaken despite everything she had endured. He nodded slowly. "Then we do it together." They chose the setting carefully. A meeting Dante called under the pretense of discussing new security measures following the thefts, gathering his senior circle including Marco in a private room where nothing could be overheard, and no one could easily leave without being noticed. The night of the meeting arrived, and Dante sat at the head of the table, calm and composed, while his men quietly took their positions around the room, close enough to act if needed but distant enough not to raise suspicion. Marco arrived exactly on time, as he always did, greeting everyone with the same easy confidence he had carried for years. "You said this was urgent," Marco said, taking his usual seat near Dante. "It is," Dante said. "I think we've finally found who's responsible for the missing shipments." Something flickered across Marco's face, quick and controlled, but Dante had spent years learning to read the smallest signs of hesitation in the people around him, and he saw it clearly. "That's good news," Marco said carefully. "Who was it?" Dante didn't answer immediately. Instead, he nodded toward the door, and it opened to reveal Alina, standing tall despite the fading bruises still visible along her temple, her eyes locked directly on Marco. The color drained from Marco's face. "She was supposed to be gone," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, a mistake that confirmed everything Dante needed to know beyond any doubt. "Gone where, Marco?" Dante asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I never told you where I sent her. I never told anyone where I sent her because I didn't know myself. So how did you know she wasn't simply out of the city, living a normal life somewhere far from here?" Marco's composure cracked further, his eyes darting toward the door, calculating an exit that no longer existed. Dante's men had already quietly closed off every path out of the room. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of," Marco said, attempting one last desperate grasp at denial. "I have proof," Dante said, sliding a folder across the table, mirroring the exact motion Marco had used against Alina weeks earlier, a symmetry that was not lost on anyone in the room. "Financial records, meeting logs, the buyers you've been working with behind my back, and now a confession you just gave me yourself standing in this room." Marco's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as he realized there was no argument left that could save him. "I built this organization alongside you," he said quietly. "I deserved more than being passed over for decisions that should have included me." "You could have spoken to me," Dante said. "Instead, you destroyed an innocent woman's life and nearly cost her everything to protect your own ambitions." "She was convenient," Marco said, the same cold words he had once said to Alina directly in that dark room, and hearing them now, in front of everyone, made his guilt undeniable to every person present. Alina stepped further into the room, her voice steady despite everything she had endured. "I trusted you," she said. "We all did." Marco said nothing, his silence the closest thing to an admission he was willing to give. Dante rose slowly from his seat, the full weight of his authority settling over the room like a shadow. "You built something in secret because you thought I wasn't paying attention," he said. "You were wrong, and now everything you built will be dismantled, piece by piece, the same way you tried to dismantle the trust that held this organization together." Marco was escorted from the room by Dante's men, his protests growing quieter as the door closed behind him, the finality of the moment settling over everyone who remained. The room stayed silent for a long moment afterward, the tension slowly easing as the truth finally, fully came to light. Dante turned to Alina, who stood watching the closed door with an expression of quiet relief, the weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. "It's over," he said softly. "It's over," she echoed, though her voice carried a note of exhaustion that spoke to everything the past weeks had cost her. Dante crossed the room and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a small gesture that felt larger than words after everything they had been through together. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said, turning to look at him directly. "You found me, you believed me even if it took time, that's enough." "It shouldn't have taken this long," he said. "I should have trusted you from the very first moment." She reached out and gently touched his arm, a small gesture that carried the weight of everything neither of them had said aloud in the years they had worked together. "You trust me now," she said. "That matters more than what happened before." Dante looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a clarity that had been building since the night he found her in that dark warehouse. He realized, standing there in the aftermath of everything that had happened, that his feelings for her had never simply been about trust or loyalty. They had grown into something far deeper, something he had spent years refusing to acknowledge because his world had never seemed like a place where something so fragile could survive. But watching her stand there, strong despite everything she had endured, he understood that fragile things could survive if they were protected carefully enough. "Alina," he said quietly, "there's something I need to say to you." She looked up at him, waiting, the room around them fading into stillness as the weight of the moment settled between them. But before he could speak the words that had been building inside him for years, one of his men entered the room quickly, urgency written across his face. "Sir," he said, "there's something you need to see. It's about Marco's contacts. There are more people involved than we realized." Dante closed his eyes briefly, the moment slipping away, replaced once again by the demands of the world he had built around himself. He looked back at Alina, an unspoken promise passing between them. "Later," he said quietly just for her. She nodded, a small smile touching her lips despite the exhaustion still lingering in her eyes. "Later," she agreed. And as Dante turned to follow his man out of the room, ready to face whatever remained of the mess Marco had left behind, he carried with him a new kind of certainty, one built not on suspicion or fear, but on trust finally restored, and a future he intended to protect with everything he had. The days following Marco's exposure were some of the busiest Dante had faced in years. Untangling the network Marco had quietly built required careful, methodical work, identifying every contact, every hidden account, every person who had been drawn into the secondary operation without fully understanding its scope. Dante approached each piece with the same precision that had built his organization in the first place, determined to leave nothing unresolved that could threaten what he had spent years protecting. Alina returned to work sooner than Dante expected, insisting she was ready despite his gentle attempts to convince her to rest longer. Within days, It was clear how much her absence had affected the smooth operation of everything around him. Nathan, gracious and understanding, stepped back into a supporting role, relieved in many ways to no longer carry the full weight of responsibilities that had never quite matched his experience. Alina moved through the office with the same quiet confidence she always had, though Dante noticed something different in the way she carried herself now, a steadiness that came from having survived something most people never could. She caught him watching her more than once during those first days back, and though neither of them spoke directly about the moment that had been interrupted the night Marco was exposed, the memory lingered between them, patient and unspoken. Weeks passed as the last threads of Marco's betrayal were finally resolved. The stolen shipments were recovered, the network dismantled, and order slowly returned to the organization Dante had worked so hard to build. Through it all, Alina remained by his side, not simply as an assistant, but as someone whose judgment he had come to rely on completely, someone whose presence steadied him in ways he hadn't fully understood until he nearly lost her. One evening, after the office had emptied and the last of the day's business had been settled, Dante found Alina still at her desk, organizing files with the same careful attention she always brought to her work. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, remembering the promise he had made to himself in that warehouse, the quiet vow to make things right no matter what it took. "You're staying late again," he said, stepping into the room. She looked up, a small smile forming. "Old habits." "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said. "Not anymore." "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm simply doing my job." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her desk, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look at him. "There's something I never finished saying to you," he said quietly. "The night we exposed Marco." Her expression softened, the memory clearly still present in her mind as well. "I remember," she said. "I've spent years telling myself that people in my position don't get to have the things other people have," he said. "Family, trust that isn't built on fear or obligation, something real." Alina set down the papers in her hands, giving him her full attention. "But watching you stand in that room, after everything Marco put you through, still strong enough to look him in the eye," Dante continued, "I realized I had been wrong about a lot of things, including what I believed I deserved or didn't deserve to have." "Dante," she said softly. "I should have trusted you from the beginning," he said. "Not because the evidence demanded it, but because I knew you. Because in 3 years, you never once gave me a reason to doubt you, and I let a single folder of lies erase all of that in an instant." "You found me," she said. "You risked everything to make it right." "It wasn't enough," he said. "Not compared to what you lost because of my mistake." She reached out and took his hand, the same way he had taken hers in that hospital room weeks earlier, the gesture carrying the same quiet weight. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters to me. Not what happened before, but what happens next." Dante studied her for a long moment, the walls he had built around himself for so many years finally, fully coming down. "I care about you," he said. "Not simply as someone I trust, or someone who makes this organization run smoothly. I care about you in a way I've never let myself feel for anyone." Alina's eyes softened, tears gathering at the corners though she smiled through them. "I've cared about you for a long time," she said. "Longer than I ever let myself admit, especially working for a man who guarded his feelings as carefully as you guarded everything else." "I'm done guarding them," he said, "at least with you." She rose from her chair, closing the small distance between them, and for the first time since the night everything had fallen apart, Dante allowed himself a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness, holding her carefully, gently, as if making up for every day he had let fear and suspicion keep them apart. In the months that followed, the organization stabilized under Dante's careful leadership, stronger and more secure than it had been before Marco's betrayal exposed its vulnerabilities. New systems were put in place to prevent anyone from being falsely accused the way Alina had been. Checks that required more than a single piece of evidence before serious action was taken against anyone within the organization. It was a lesson Dante carried with him permanently, a reminder of how close he had come to destroying something irreplaceable through haste and fear. Alina's role expanded beyond what it had been before. Her insight and steady judgment recognized not just by Dante, but by the entire senior circle, who had come to respect her resilience through everything she had endured. She never let the experience define her, choosing instead to let it strengthen her, a quiet testament to her own strength that inspired the same respect and loyalty in others that she had always shown Dante. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, built on the trust that had been tested and ultimately proven unbreakable. Dante learned to lean on her not just as someone who managed his world, but as someone who understood him more completely than anyone else ever had, someone who had earned every bit of the trust he had once so carelessly thrown away. On a quiet evening months later, the two of them sat together on the balcony of Dante's home, overlooking the city he had spent his life building and protecting. The light stretched out below them, endless and glittering, a reminder of everything he had fought to hold on to and everything he had nearly lost. "Do you ever think about that night?" Alina asked quietly, "in the warehouse?" Dante was silent for a moment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "Every day," he said honestly. "It reminds me how easily I could have lost everything that actually mattered." "But you didn't," she said, resting her head against his shoulder. "We're still here." "We are," he said, wrapping an arm around her, pulling her closer against the cool evening air. "And I don't intend to take that for granted again." She smiled softly, closing her eyes, content in the quiet safety of the moment, a safety that had been hard-won and was all the more precious because of it. Below them, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the storm that had passed through the lives of the two people watching over it from above. But for Dante and Alina, the storm had finally settled, leaving behind something stronger than either of them had known before, a bond forged not simply through loyalty or duty, but through truth uncovered, trust rebuilt, and a future they intended to protect together, no matter what challenges still waited ahead. The city lights glowed steadily into the night, and for the first time in a long while, Dante Marchetti allowed himself to simply be still, at peace, beside the one person who had never stopped believing in him, even when he had briefly stopped believing in her. It was, he realized, the only ending that had ever truly mattered.